In this video, I am going to show just a very basic program that can be used to program the robot arm. In a previous video, I gave a brief demonstration of how this robot works. And I just moved each motor independently with its own program. And in this video, I'm going to upgrade that program to now use loops and switches in my program so that you can control the robot. And when I say this is very simple, what I mean is I'm not even using the sensors. Like, you have the sensor up here to let you know when the robot arm has reached its maximum elevation. I'm not using that. And there's also a push button down here. I don't know if this is going to focus for me, but there's a push button down here that tells you when the robot arm has moved all the way over into the maximum clockwise position. I'm not using those. I am just using the buttons on the brick to either move the robot arm up, like in this case it'll move up, and I can use the other button to push it down. If I want it to rotate clockwise, I push this button. Counterclockwise, I push this button. And again, like if I'm going up, you're going to see that it doesn't use the sensor. If I hold the up button, like right now it's at its maximum elevation, but I can keep running that button and it just keeps going and going and going. And obviously I don't want to run it too far. So it's not using the sensors. It's just very simple. You just use the push buttons. If you push it, the motor goes in one direction. If you release the button, the motor stops. Now I have this push button because for motor A is the one controlling the claw here. I'm using the center button to move motor A in one direction. That's just the center button here. And then to move that motor in an opposite direction, I ran out of buttons on the brick. So I had to use the other touch sensor. So I can push this to make that claw go in the motor in the opposite direction. Now, one thing to remember that I noted in the other video is that if I make that motor go in one direction, it's going to open and then continue to close. So I'll open it and then close it. And now, if I push that button again, you can hear that the motor, actually the gears are skipping, they're braking. I can't move that motor anymore. Just mechanically, the claw doesn't allow me to do that. So I now have to move the motor in the opposite direction. So if I push this button, you'll see it's going to open, and then it's going to continue to close. And if I keep holding this button, the gears are slipping again. And so obviously, you don't want to do that. So I'll stop doing that. But once I've gone too far in that direction, I now have to use the center button to now open and close it. Okay, so that's just the way that I've done it. I'm not going to go to the software and show you how I did that. Here is the software for this, and I have just called this EricRobotArm.ev3. That's the name of the project, and within that project you can see I have a lot of different programs. These are all independent programs, and the one that I'm going to focus on right now is just called Hold Buttons, because the way this works, this software that I'm running, it does not rely on the sensors. It's just if you hold a button to turn one of the motors, it turns the motor and it keeps trying to turn the motor until you let go of it. All right, so let's look at this and let's start from the outside and work our way in. If you see this, what I have, by the way, by the time you're watching this video, you should have already learned how to use loops, which is this outer thing, and then also switches, which I have two of them inside the loop. So what we have here, let's look at the loop first. On the outside, what we have is an infinite loop. It just runs forever. So basically everything that you see inside of this loop, that is the main program, and it runs over and over and over again, and it will keep running until the battery dies or until you hit the abort button to stop the program. Okay, so that's all that this outer loop is. So you can kind of ignore the outer loop and now focus on what is inside. On the inside of the loop, I have two switches. And so basically what happens is in this switch, the program is looking to see if any of the brick buttons have been pressed. You see, this would be the right button, this would be the left button, the up button, and this would be the down button. and then the center button. And of course, if no button is pushed, then this is just empty. We're not doing anything over here. In this switch, what we are doing is we're looking to see if the extra push button has been pressed. It's plugged into port 2, so that's the separate push button that I have that controls a different motor. So just as a refresher, when you have a switch, there are two different ways that you can view the switch. Remember, the switch is just a conditional statement. And so what this switch is doing is it's checking to see if a button has been pressed, and the code will execute different code depending on what button is pressed, or if no button has been pressed. So in this case, I'm looking at this, I'm viewing this in the tabbed mode. So I have these tabs up here that I can click on to see if a certain button is pushed, what code is going to execute. And if you look at this tiny little picture right here, you can see that if I select this one, that this is the code that is going to execute if the right button is pushed. Okay, so I have these different tabs up here. I can see what code executes depending on which button is pressed. I just configured that by clicking on this button, and I said brick buttons, measure brick buttons. So that configures this switch structure. Now, if I wanted to view this in a tabbed mode, or a flat mode, I can click on this little button, and now what it does is instead of putting them in tabs, I can scroll up and down, and I can see here's the same little picture, but I see that in a flat mode, so I can just scroll down and see the different ones, the different code that is going to execute depending on which button is pressed. I'm going to do a Control-Z to undo that, because I really prefer to keep as much as possible on a single screen. So I like to use the tabbed mode almost all the time. So if you notice, all of the tabs in this switch statement, they almost all look the same. The only difference is, well, of course, the main difference is if no button is pressed up here, then I'm not going to do anything. But if the right button is pressed, I am going to move C with a positive value for power. That's if the right brick button is pressed. If the left brick button is pressed, I'm going to move motor C in a negative power direction. Okay, so and then everything else in these is pretty much the same. So let's just look at this one since I'm already on this tab. If I press the left button, then it is going to turn motor C on. It's just going to turn it on infinitely. I'm not telling it to go for a certain number of seconds because we don't know how long, or at least the program doesn't know how long it's going to be on. It depends on how long the person is pressing the button. So I just tell it to turn on, and then I use a wait function to wait until that button is released. So, and then after it waits, after it detects that the button is released, then I just simply turn off motor C. So if you want to look at this wait function, I can click on this, and what I said is brick buttons, compare brick buttons. And then on this one, on this input, I just simply put a checkbox in the button that I'm looking for. In this case, I'm looking for the left button. I want to wait until the left button has been released. Okay. Then on this input, I select, do I want to wait until the button is pressed or bumped? And obviously, like I've been saying, I want to wait until that button has been released. Okay, so in this switch code, in this case, if the left button is pressed, then it's going to turn on motor C in a negative power, so it's in the reverse direction, and it is going to wait until that button has been released, and then it's going to stop the motor. And if you go and you look at all of the other switch cases, they are all the same. It's just using a different motor, either in the forward or backward rotation. So in this case, if I press the right button, again, I'm turning on motor C in a positive power, and then I wait until button 3 is released, and then once it detects that button is released, then I stop the motor. So then I just created these switch cases for each one of the buttons. And so that covers this switch statement. Over here, this switch statement, the only reason I needed this is because this one uses the push button. And I can't put the push button in here because this switch is just, it can only look at the brick buttons. And so what I had to do is I had to create another switch to now monitor the push button. So every time this outer while loop executes, the first thing it's going to do is check to see if one of the brick buttons has been pressed. And once it completes all of this code, it's now immediately going to go and execute this code, which will detect if the press button, the push button that is connected to port 2 has been pressed. And if so, it's going to turn motor A on, and I used a value of -15. Then I'm going to use a wait function to see if the, I'll do the touch sensor compare state to see if it has been released. And if that push button has been released, then I finally stop motor A. So that's it. That is all that is in this program. It's just simply a while loop with 2 switch statements running inside of that while loop for eternity until the abort button has been pressed.